Welcome to Portals of Perception, where we inquire about the future and how we humans are evolving. Our core premise is that the shift underway reveals itself through all the core domains of life. And today we are asking about how religion and the spiritual endeavor itself are evolving. I'm here with Brendan Graham Dempsey. Brendan offers a compelling vision of a Christianity that is both grounded in tradition and responsive to the challenges and opportunities of the contemporary world. He invites us to rethink religion and faith in light of metamodern insights and to embrace a more dynamic and inclusive spirituality. Brendan is the author of several books, including Emergentism, a religion of complexity for the metamodern world, and a universal learning process, the evolution of meaning. Brendan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on this wonderful podcast. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into all these topics with you. So thanks, appreciate it.
Well, so we want to explore what is a metamodern way to approach religion, and inside it go deep on metamodern Christianity. And I'm also hoping that we, through that, reflect on the long wave of sacred history from really the ancient world through to what is emerging now. So how about if I try to offer a very brief distilled assimilation of some of what I've absorbed in listening to your conversations, and give you in that sense a platform to build on and develop. How about that? Okay.
That sounds great.
Well, so you're describing an emergent, perhaps I can call it emergentist universe, where the interior nature of the universe arises out of a core impulse that involves a learning process. And you're describing there, you're lifting really learning from a pedestrian concept into a more of a qualitative, complexifying, unfolding emergence that represents both the thermodynamic nature of the universe and the spiritual nature of the universe, and perhaps the spiritualizing work that's occurring in the universe, if I can say so. And it is a story of a complexifying learning from which the properties of life, mind, and culture arise, including meaning and value. And you integrate into that story and perspective the way of the evolution of faith and religion and how they evolve, all the way from the ancient world to the meta-modern frontier, where that narrative, which we're about to explore today, describes how the very relationship of human consciousness, human experience with what we describe with the idea of divine revelation, how that is evolving also inside that evolutionary story. So how about that as an effort at a simplified assimilation of your work?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I should hire you to summarize these things, because you do a better job of it than I probably would myself. So no, that's wonderful. And even though that is sort of a platform for me now to maybe kind of build off of, it's quite a broad platform. So I'm happy to kind of dig into any aspect of that, but that is sort of the broad story that I'm trying to put out with my work, which and my work does cover a lot of different aspects of this this story. I've been, in a sense, throughout my entire life trying to put the pieces of this narrative together, and my own biography has been a big part of that. And so for the work I'm doing now, I'm really drawing on really my entire background to date to try to come up with a very comprehensive, coherent vision of this, evolving emergentist conception of a learning universe in which the evolution of faith and religion is a key vital part. And so yeah, we can take this then wherever you'd like to start with that. But I will just say the book that you mentioned, A Universal Learning Process, is one where I kind of introduce a lot of these ideas. It's sort of the introductory chapter, I guess, in a large singular work that's trying to tackle this whole big topic. And so it introduces a lot of these issues from the ground up, sort of from the most, kind of singular, primitive, fundamental level, and then tries to kind of build up this picture from that. So that book you mentioned, gets a little bit hopefully not too much in the weeds for people who are, especially for folks who are interested in that sort of thing, like information theory and thermodynamics and whatnot. But really my interest is just to kind of, sort of frame this big story that I'm trying to tell and trying to ground it in a meaningful way. And ultimately for me, yeah, the significance really of this big story is about human beings and where we fit into the cosmic kind of tale of the universe and what it is that we're doing, and then ultimately what is a relationship to God, quote unquote, look like, and what does that mean in that process? And that's a lot of what this work is about. So happy to pick up from anywhere in that story that you'd like.
Yeah, so, and we will go deep into all those spaces and look at sacred history and try to integrate sacred her story, not just history. And when I use the term her story rather than his story, I do not mean that in the feminist sense of telling the story of humanity, but more in the sense that there is an invisible dimension to that story that is vibrantly alive beyond the archaeological relics. So, and this is where we will try to search to make some esoteric forays into some aspects of the story. But since you already mentioned that so much of this has been enmeshed in your own biography, how would you lead us into integrating that? What brought you, how would you describe what brought you to the inquiry and the sense of the propelling inspiration to search for an updated way to access spirituality and religion?
Yeah, so briefly, I was raised in a very religious family, very Christian, kind of conservative Christian milieu. And that really much informed my sense of my career path and what I was going to do with my life. I'm the sort of person that when I see that something is important, I kind of throw my whole self into it. I don't know. I've just always kind of been that way. And so when I was younger, in my kind of teen years, for me, I identified that most important thing as being my faith, my Christian faith. And so I felt this is the thing that I should devote my life to. And I had the conception of becoming some kind of, say, professor at a seminary teaching biblical history or Christian history or something like that. Wanted to move into academia and study my faith and the Bible from kind of just a very rigorous and in-depth vantage. And so I started out on that path. And as I did that and really started deepening in my understanding, my learning of the tradition and the languages and the composition history and these sorts of things, a lot of what I had grown up with believing to be true was in conflict with what sort of the modern historical critical approach was, had now become consensus over, the past 200 years, let's say. And this was something of a shock. It was something of a disillusionment. And at the same time, because I had really moved into this space from a very kind of like a dedicated commitment to really see what the arguments were and to grapple with the evidence and that sort of a thing, it wasn't something that I could unsee. I felt very convinced by the conclusions of this modern tradition of studying religion, that there was so much here that was really insightful and had a lot to bear on how we understand religion, and in my case specifically Christianity. And so because of that, I couldn't fully reconcile these two different ways of looking at Christianity that I had experience with. And it seemed like the only way forward was just eventually to give up on the faith that I'd grown up in and to just embrace a kind of critical attitude to all of this. And for me at the time, that looked like, a form of sort of rationalist atheism, materialism, a kind of a scientific reductionism, that sort of worldview, which seemed like the only alternative that I could really identify at the time. And so that was a huge existential break for me, an existential crisis, you could say, a meaning crisis, but I didn't really see any other way forward. And so I abandoned my path of, becoming a professor of Christian history, and my life trajectory took a sharp turn in a different direction. And I started reading a lot. I started trying to make sense of, a different worldview, and read a lot of philosophy, read a lot of literature. And over the course of some years, really spent a lot of time working through these ideas. And started to really appreciate the way in which religions and God concepts evolve. This started to become a really compelling idea to me, and I was really keen on appreciating the way that artists had actually often had a role in this, poets and creative thinkers who have served in the past a kind of prophetic function, you could say. I think of William Blake or even Jung or people like that who have done some kind of creative myth making of some kind. And this opened up a new way of thinking about all of this. And I began to see this sort of movement that I'd gone through of sort of a, traditional faith to a more kind of critical faith as being its own kind of version of a evolution of my own way of thinking about God. Later on, as I discovered the work of, say, Ken Wilber and integral theory, this gave a new I don't know, way of looking at all this in terms of development, in terms of actually that as we go through learning, our conceptions of God change. And that really kind of hit home because as I studied very deeply a lot of the developmental literature, Piaget and the psychological literature, James Fowler, people like that, who had looked at things of what they called like stages of faith or religious judgment. And there was a clear way in which the learning process that we go through as people impacts the conceptions that we have of the divine and the meaning of life and value and all these things. And it was not only that, it was also that the models that they were presenting matched my own experience very, very well. It was sort of like, oh yeah, I know what that phase is like in that phase. And this gave me this sort of map of looking at my own experience in terms of this developmental learning process, which then dovetailed, again, with these evolutionary concepts of God and the role that, again, still creative thinkers and artists play in helping that evolutionary process. So the last thing I'll say about that is just that this really opened up a whole new avenue for me to explore these topics that have really, occupied my mind for the past 25 years, let's say. And I got really excited about trying to understand not just my own story, but kind of the human story in light of learning and in light of an evolution of God concepts through learning and development. And I guess the final thing that kind of puts the glue into all of these pieces was this recognition that there does seem to be some meaningful way in which individual learning processes have similar properties to our collective cultural learning that we do. This was an intuition I'd already had in my own work for some time, but as I started getting into the work of Wilber, but also Piaget and Habermas and some of the more recent thinkers on this topic, got really excited by being able to draw out those parallels and analogs. And so my work now is really about trying to map the evolution of the God concept and religion and faith, and specifically Christianity as well, in light of these sort of learning models in a way that I think can shed light on the way that these ideas change through time. But I think more importantly, there's a way of actually looking at this whole story as itself a kind of sacred history, that there's something about God, that God is evolving, we are participating in that. And of course, all this leads to the question of what's next and what's sort of what's on the horizon for the evolving God concept, things like that. So that's a brief take at that.
Yeah, exciting. So it sounds as though you initially sought to resolve your own cognitive and perhaps soul conflict as well. It sounds like there was a dimension of a soul search and a mapping search, and as you look to solve your own conflict, you discover that your own personal journey was becoming a fractal replica of that whole story. So how about if we actually pick up the story there? Where do you begin to tell the story of the concept of God in, say, the ancient world, and perhaps comment to it in the way you've been introduced to it, so we can weave the story not just in the third person perspective, but also in the way it has been journeyed and integrated through time. So where would you begin the trace of the evolution of the God concept through time?
Sure. Yeah, and as you say, like there's kind of two major ways you could try to go about that. You could start at the cultural level and then make comparisons to the individual level, or you could start at the individual level and make comparisons to the cultural. I think for the sake of this conversation, let's start at the cultural level, and then we can kind of tie in the individual. So also I should I left this out of my biography, but I studied classical civilizations, religious studies in my undergrad, and so that's informed a lot of my understanding around these sorts of things, because I have my bachelor's degree in looking at ancient civilizations. And so if we're going to start with where does God begin, we're going to be starting with ancient civilizations and ancient societies. And so in many ways, what you'd really do is look at the entire kind of human story. And if you wanted to look at it that way, I think it can be helpful to maybe use an example of, if people are familiar with the work of Harari. He wrote a book called Sapiens, right, in which he traces the evolution of humanity, basically all the way from kind of Neolithic hunter-gatherers all the way to the present. And so that could be a kind of starting place, right? Would be somewhere around 70,000 years ago. There's this cognitive revolution, some call it, and you get the emergence of kind of what looks to us like the dawn of cultural kinds of behavior that are very similar to the sorts of things that human beings still do. So if you start all the way back there and then you follow this trajectory forward, you kind of get these broad phases that people often identify. And I find this really helpful to work with a framework like this of, for many thousands of years, where human beings are foraging, living hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Eventually, around 10,000 BC, let's say, you get the advent of agriculture. And so then you start seeing these early civilization states in ancient Mesopotamia, for example. And then around 500 BC, you get this thing called the Axial Age, where most of the world religions kind of emerge out of and form the basis of the kind of traditional religious worldview that is very dominant for many centuries, up until essentially modernity. And then modernity represents kind of a break from this earlier traditional religious perspective. And then most recently, the break from the modern perspective itself, which comes with the postmodern move in the 20th century. And as my work specifically focuses on, in addition to that, this break from the postmodern, which we're calling the metamodern. So those are kind of the broad periods that you can track, you could say, human cultural evolution through. And then, of course, I always want to throw out a major caveat for anyone listening that these are heuristics. Everything, when we're looking at this scale, is going to be a bit oversimplified, a bit kind of coarse-grained, right? So when you really want to tell this story in great depth and detail, which is something I'm very passionate about doing, a lot of nuance and details and divergences, outliers need to come in as well. And that work's super important. But for a conversation like this, we'll stick at the level of sort of, big strokes. So at the earliest stage there of sort of Neolithic hunter-gatherer forager societies, the anthropological literature gives a sense that the notion of the divine, let's say, or the sacred, is rather different from what we tend to think of in terms of like gods or God. it has much more to do with kind of sacred taboo energies and totems. There's a kind of interesting cross-cultural term or idea, rather, that you find in different forager societies, that's some kind of disembodied spirit of some kind, or a kind of power that inheres in things, is probably a better way of thinking about it. The sociologist Emil Durkheim popularized, in particular, a term for this, which was mana, which M-A-N-A, which is the sense of like this sacred essence that inheres in things and people. And there's a kind of power to it. It gives people vitality. It gives people strength. But you know, this is sort of, I would say, one way of thinking about the God concept in kind of forager hunter-gatherer societies. And it's very this worldly. It's very immanent. There isn't really a sharp distinction between this world, other world, things like that so much. But there is this sense that that particularly important, potent, and sacred things exist in the world. And of course, there's, you know, kind of notions that these are tied to the ancestors, and the origins of kind of human society. And things are very small also in this context, right? I mean, you're talking about relatively small bands of people. And so a lot of the kind of sacred world reflects most people's kind of daily concerns on that front. There's not really a lot of abstraction or generalization. It's very, very particular, very specific. And so that would be one kind of notion of like where the sense of this divinity or the sacredness inhering in things starts to really emerge in the human story. And so I mean, I'll pause there. Is this a good level of granularity, or is it too much? Or yeah.
No, it is, and I think we want to lead into then the story and pick it up and go deep in the axial transition.
Yeah.
I will say that at another time, perhaps on your channel, we will come back and I will retell that story with another way, another framing, another time, where essentially, but I'll just name it now, that phase, the pre-axial phase, I will describe as planetary religions, where humans are more oriented to the planetary experience. And I'll come back after you frame the axial and suggest something about the idea of an axial. Sure. What is an axial religion? So how would you lead through that transition? We're leaving for now aside, by the way, the ancient Egyptian culture. That's something else to pick up another time, at least in the way I tell that story. But let's proceed.
Yeah, well, I think that this really does all start to change once you get agricultural states, and people start becoming sedentary in terms of where they're living. And then you see the emergence of sort of these power hierarchies. You get a very kind of pyramidal structure to society. And what you get is sort of this shift into a kind of mediated relationship between people and this sacred force, essentially. So you see the emergence of priests and temples and sort of special spaces where this thing happens. Also, what really comes online in a big way is sacrifice, ritual sacrifice, which these priests are doing. And these priests and the temple sort of complex are deeply enmeshed in the political structure, which, is this kind of often kind of a god king, some kind of king. And this, again, is sort of this top-down sort of very stratified sort of society. And I think people will be familiar with this sort of arrangement of the sacred concept from a lot of polytheistic traditions. You mentioned the ancient Egyptians, but it's really interesting because this is where that sacred concept really starts to be very anthropomorphic, whereas earlier it's not so much. It's a lot more kind of, there's this amorphous power that's kind of moving between things, or it might be found here or there or what have you. But at this level, you start getting gods in a kind of personified way, and these pantheons of gods and the worship of gods and this sort of a thing. And so that's the kind of structure and the kind of God concept that's very prevalent in these ancient imperial societies for many hundreds of years. And then, as you say, there's this axial age shift where things become, they shift yet again, let's say. And one of the things that happens that's really important is that that there is this movement towards the transcendent and the disembodied, the abstract, the kind of generalized big picture. And again, this is, you see this occurring between 800 BC to 200 BC, thereabouts. We think of the changes that happen, let's say, in ancient Greece, where Plato is and Socrates are talking now about God and actually critiquing the way that Homer had talked about God, if you're, or the gods, I should say. So there's a lot of Platonic dialogues that, kind of chide Homer for his irreligious depictions of the gods. They aren't acting in good behavior, and they're it's a too simplistic notion. And so there's a sense that the theistic notion is getting this update. And one of the things there that really is important as well is that it's a moral concept, that God is somehow good and moral, not just really powerful, the way that God had been in kind of the polytheistic society and earlier. And as you follow that back into forager societies as well, there's a very amoral notion about the mana, or the kind of sacred essence of things. Sometimes it'll hurt you, sometimes it'll help you. It's very hard to know. But by the time you get to the axial age, there is this kind of cross-cultural shift into thinking about the divine in terms of the good and morality. And so examples of that you can find in the shift that Jewish religion takes in the ancient Israelite conceptions of God as well. Earlier strata of kind of the story are very again very kind of anthropomorphic, anthropocentric. As you move into later strata of that story being told, you see more abstract and general notions of the divine coming through, more rational conceptions, and the switch to really emphasizing law. And the whole kind of notion of Torah becoming really paramount, and also even the book itself as a sort of legible, kind of abstract, logocentric relationship to the divine. And so many cross-cultural examples could be presented. And I'll pause there after saying just briefly that this little outline of, let's say Neolithic hunter-gatherer forager religion to archaic imperial agricultural religion to axial age religion is a pretty common way of looking at this. The work of Robert Bellah, he wrote a book called, I think it's called Religion and Human Evolution, and he has basically this exact taxonomy. He calls them tribal, archaic, and axial forms of religiousness. So we'll pause there again, just if you have any reflections on any of that.
Well, I'd like you to then lead from that into the appearance of the work of Jesus and the founding of Christianity, which formally is viewed to be outside or post the axial age, but in my mind has always represented the culmination of the axial age rather than something that's separated from it.
Definitely. I see it very similarly. I mean, the axial age is kind of thought of this, this pivot moment in history where these new ideas emerge for the first time. But if you look at the ministry of Jesus, the kinds of ideas that he's expressing are just a continuation of those sorts of ideas that emerged for the first time then. So I mean, I think it's important to view Jesus's ministry through that light, because a lot of the kind of classic tensions that come out in the gospel texts relate to this kind of issue. For example, in the Gospels, Jesus is this figure who's often butting heads with the religious authorities of the time, and the different kind of schools of thought, the different religious schools of thought, and getting into a lot of arguments, you could say, and a lot of challenges, being challenged and challenging in return. And, I'll say, obviously, as an important caveat too, these are texts that we get from Christian writers, so we're always having to keep that in mind of the filter that's there. But at least in terms of the Christian tradition, how that's been kind of read is that Jesus shows up and is really trying to get people to live from the heart, you could say, rather than from the rules, right? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? That sort of thing, which is a very kind of axial idea, which is that in the pre-axial period, in that in that period of earlier sacrificial temple religion, it's very much emphasizing, the rite, R-I-T-E, the kind of ritualistic act, kind of ritualistic purity, a sense of like these certain things that you do and do in the right order. And if you don't do them in the right order, then you've done them wrong. You need to repeat them, this sort of thing, which is very external. It's very kind of it's very oriented towards kind of, yeah, superficial, you could say, in the sense that if you're not actually invested in these things from an internal standpoint, then it's sort of what's the point? And all these ideas had been, well, I don't want to say all, many of these ideas had been prefigured in the Jewish prophets. You've got folks saying, you'll have to help me remember which prophet said, I think it's Hosea, right? He says that he's speaking for God, saying that your sacred feasts and your rites are meaningless to me, but it's the circumcision of the heart and these sorts of things. No, I might be now, of course, already starting to mix in Paul, who again is sort of carrying the same kind of axial tradition forward. But a lot of the Jewish prophets already in the let's say 7th century, 6th century, onward, were themselves already trying to articulate this notion that it's about, the inwardness. The Lord looks at, no, the world looks at the outside of a person, but the Lord looks at the heart, these sorts of things. And you see this all the way in the Psalms and all this. So there's this already in the Jewish tradition, and something that Jesus himself, again, kind of, epitomizes in a very grand way, is showing up, butting up against the very kind of more externally focused sense of religious purity, and trying to really hit home on the importance of the ethical and the moral, right? It's the story of the Good Samaritan. It's not who is my neighbor in some sense of by blood or by nationality, but it's who does kindness to another person, who loves their neighbor, all these sorts of things. And so I think the ministry of Jesus, as we read it in the Gospels, is very much a continuation of that sort of Jewish axial tradition.
Well, so, and then how do you bring into this narrative the appreciation of the Christ and that esoteric dimension? Again, yeah. Let me actually make the space for you, and then I'll offer an alternative esoteric appreciation of that. But
sure.
Please.
Well, of course, so the notion of the Christ, right, is we can say there are some kind of esoteric or exo or esoteric formulations of an idea like that. The kind of exoteric formulation is, Christos, the Greek word for Mashiach, which is like the Messiah, the anointed one. There was this expected story, given the history of the Israelite tradition, the ending of the monarchy, that there would be the return of the Davidic monarch, and that this would take on sort of cosmic proportions, and that figure would be the Davidic king come again, and this was the Christ. And so that story kind of is in the background of Jesus' ministry when he shows up, and it had all these kind of apocalyptic overtones to it. Of course, the Christian tradition really subverts and distorts, extrapolates, inverts, however you want to talk about it, that idea, reinterpreting it in light of Jesus's death. But the kind of notion there initially is this sense that the Christ is the figure who will kind of save the people from oppression, exoterically. Esoterically, it comes to take on all this deeper meaning and importance. And so, really in an important way in the Christian tradition, the idea of Christ is the idea of the divine, in a sense that is there with God at the beginning, that, is the means of salvation for all of humanity, ultimately. And then we start getting into the stuff of Christian theology. I want to, in the kind of work I'm doing around metamodern Christianity, continue to develop and invert and expand this idea, as it's always been done throughout the history, because this is what's always happening, right? The God concept continues to evolve. And so I'm trying to emphasize different aspects of this archetype and what it means for us, what it can mean for us today, expanding it further. And I could say a lot more about that, but those are just, yeah, some kind
Yeah.
of benchmarks.
And we do want to proceed the story in a minute in terms of, so how is the concept of God evolved through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and to the all the way to the modern and then postmodern era. But I will just see that, so an alternative esoteric, what I will sometimes describe as a flying upside down view of this, is that what you describe in the earlier hunterers and gatherer tribal societies, these were what I suggested we could call planetary religions, where, as you said, mana, but really what can also be described as nature spirits. The spirit that lives in the plant, the spirit that lives in the rock, the spirit that lives in the tree, and the spirit that lives in everything in the day-to-day life is indeed where power is. And that, yes, there is the agrarian revolution inside of which there is a certain activation of organizing capacities, but that can be seen to be a transitional phase to the axial. Now, when we say axial, what do we actually mean by axial? We mean that something revolves around something. So if you were to, for a minute, to take an imaginary story in which we humans are evolving with an accompanying presence that is intelligent of its nature, in which I'm not describing another world, but actually a world that coexists, co-arises with us, in which there is a teleology, and that's something to explore with the way you describe the complexifying learning process. Is there directionality there? Is there causality there? Is there teleology there? These are questions to reflect on. But for a minute, let's imagine that there is that dimension of evolving in the direction of wisdom and refinement and greater intelligence. Then you could say that the axial revolution represents that we, instead of looking down at the forest floor, we look up and we look at the sun. And that we could imagine the rise of axial religions, both in the East and the West, as a petitional search to enter a communion with something that for them represented more than planetary, in the power that the sun represents, but that is more than a concept, more than a conceptual dimension, that there is an energetic dimension to it in which the Christ is the culmination of that. So therefore you can envision the ancient Greeks and the Jewish arising, and in the East, that the very idea of the Buddha is some kind of a searching petition to free the mind, to make space for something else to inhabit human life rather than the monkey mind. What is that something else? Well, it is, in that idea, a Christ-inspired spirit that represents communion with something bigger than the planetary human. So that's what I'd offer as an alternative imaginary story that we can contemplate. So I don't know if you'd want to comment to that, but then actually lead the story onward, because I'm very interested to how do you map the story onward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just as good a framing or a languaging of this, right? There are different terms and metaphors and whatnot we can use to talk about this, but I think you're describing the same thing I'm in many ways trying to put my finger on as well. So all of that works very well. And And I mean, across all of these shifts, there are these various kinds of what you could say are continuities and discontinuities, right? It's evolving. So there's something moving on, meaning that it's not totally different. It's not totally discontinuous, but it's also not totally the same. There's this change in a direction. And we can put our finger on precisely what's changing and what's different in slightly different ways, but I think we're tracking the same kinds of transformations underway.
Just to double click for a moment this idea of continuity and discontinuity, why is that an important idea when we are tracing evolutionarily? Why do we need to become aware of this continuity and discontinuity?
Yeah, I think it's really crucial. There's many ways. There's so much that could be said about this topic, but I guess maybe a simple way of putting it is just that we stand to get very confused if we are seeing continuities where there aren't, or if we're imposing discontinuities where there aren't. Let's say, if we are trying to track evolution, and we're trying to track evolution of something through time, which is, that's really just what that word evolve means, change through time, then we've got all that right in the package right there of discontinuity and continuity, because we've got change over time. So there's discontinuity, but there's something that is changing over time, meaning that there's continuity, right? So in the same way that when I grow up as a person, I'm not just always someone radically different from moment to moment. There's deep continuity in my life story that makes it meaningful for us to talk about Brendan, whether that means, Brendan at 35 or at 20 years old or 15 or 80. So there's continuity there and what we mean by that. But of course, the Brendan at 35 is also very discontinuous and different compared to the Brendan at 10 years old. And so when we're trying to look at these things as evolutionary, developmental, or learning processes, we always have to be tracking, well, what's the same and what's different? And I do think that there is this fundamental continuity here that you expressed well, which is that there's kind of this parallel development going on, or parallel change of us and human evolution and human cultural change. But then also this thing on top of that, underneath it, whatever you want to talk about it, is sort of the aspect of the divine that's carrying forward through this process as well. And there are multiple ways of thinking about what the connection is between these. But I think that kind of parallel track metaphor is an interesting way of thinking about the process. And without getting too complex about it, right? There is this notion that as we change, it is changing. And as it changes, we're changing. And somehow there's this dance or relationship between us as this is all unfolding.
Indeed, the beauty of what you are outlining in this idea of continuity and discontinuity is that it frees us up to, in two senses. First of all, it frees us up to the idea of divine revelation, even in our time, in the sense that we are not merely defined by, by all that has happened before us. In other words, the present doesn't have to be just a continuation of the past. It can also be the unlocking of new universal potential, even in the idea that this beautiful planet is whooshing through space to a zip code in the larger universe in terms of a space that the planet has never been in before. So there is universal plasma energy that's arriving here, if you want to bring into it a bit of a scientific dimension, at least a bit of that, but also in the sense of the personal biography that you're telling, because it frees you up to, yes, I want to acknowledge, yes, I want to recognize all those who have gone before me, and yet I spiritually, I would like to give myself, I would like to claim the permission to think new thoughts. Now, I know you could argue that everything that everybody is saying perhaps is a footnote to Plato or somebody else that has spoken before. There is a certain defiance that the permission of this continuity affords us to say, no, we can imagine a future for humanity that is at least not defined by all that has happened before. So with that, where would you want to pick the story? I mean, chronologically, there is an important point around, is it 325?
Of Constantine?
The Council of Nicaea, where we decide what's in the Bible and what's outside the Bible. And one of the things that are alongside the Trinitarian view that's established, there is also the decision to leave out the feminine gender. So it's all about the masculine gender is and you may tell it differently, but the goddess is left out because it's the Son and God, and it's mostly he in the Bible. There isn't very much a descriptive of the creative feminine principle, or at least it becomes invisible in the scripture. So I don't know if you can somehow weave the story from there through to the Middle Ages, and how will you pick it up into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment? We're interested to bridge from the ministry of Jesus all the way to the modern world. So I'll leave you the space to tell the story any way you choose.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you could zoom in on and look at, that moment when Christianity gets picked up by the Roman Empire and sort of nationalized is a fascinating moment. On the topic just of the divine feminine real quick, it is interesting just to note that does have a place also in axial thought. If you look at the notion of Sophia, which is a feminine word in these wisdom traditions, that becomes wisdom itself becomes this kind of aspect of the divine feminine that weaves into a lot of the axial traditions in a bit of a peripheral, marginal way, but it's still there. And you see that in a lot of the wisdom literature, and even in some of the early Christian theology, which relates wisdom, Sophia, to the Logos, to Christ. Then Christ somehow has this kind of a divine feminine aspect. And anyway, that's just a rabbit hole that could be gone down. But I think in terms of picking up the story...
Well, just to stay there, Mary is a very important presence.
Sure.
And if you went even back to earlier to an axial phase, Miriam is a very important presence in the arising of Moses, right? And right, Miriam is accompanying the Israelites as they walk in the desert. What is that presence that essentially keeps them alive? So somehow the feminine presence that keeps this thing going and keeps it alive is somewhat concealed, somewhat hidden or removed from the official text, even though you're saying it's actually always nearby.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the kinds of archetypes of masculine, feminine are so interwoven into the human experience that they're going to be at all the strata of this story, albeit certain strata definitely emphasize the patriarchal aspect much more, and so that can become more marginal. But I think to some degree it's always there, and at different moments in the evolution of the process, it definitely gets foregrounded more and more. I think probably the postmodern moment is when the divine feminine really makes a resurgence in a very profound way. Also, in the story that I told earlier, I didn't even mention much a whole period of human religious evolution in which you find a lot of the Venus figures and some kind of worship of a kind of goddess figure. And so that's there very early on as well, in forager societies, as well as an interesting aspect of that particular moment in the divine conception. But yeah, in terms of just kind of carrying that idea forward of where things move after the axial period, I do think axial thought, in a sense, starts to it kind of erodes a little bit in the Western medieval period, and there's reasons for that I could go into, but I think we can see that even though a lot of the kind of infrastructure or the institutions of axial Christianity do carry forward in the form of like the church, there's not really a lot of the kind of otherwise economic and cultural development to sustain some of the deeper axial insights that go along with that. And so you do see a kind of move back into thinking that is, much more kind of akin to certain kinds of polytheism and whatnot. So there's that element that happens in the medieval period. It's also worth mentioning that as new kind of modes or levels of the conception of the divine come online, it's not like they're totally superseding previous ones. They just kind of stack on top. So there's always some kind of engagement with nature spirits and that kind of like, earthy kind of divinity. There's always some kind of penchant towards a certain kind of polytheism, et cetera. And so as these things build, they're kind of like sediments or layers that build on top of each other. And so the medieval period is an interesting moment where you've got a lot of that happening in the mix. But in terms of where the next layer comes online, it is, I think, with the early modern period and the early Renaissance leading into the whole growth of the Enlightenment and scientific thought that really starts to change the way that people conceive of the divine and the sacred. And the whole edifice of kind of the religious worldview, the traditional pre-modern religious worldview, really starts to break and shatter as science and industry and new forms of mechanics and astronomy and a whole new worldview starts to appear. And so the divine concept really starts to shift. One of the things that happens is that, at least initially, people start to think of God in more mechanistic terms, you could say. You get the rise of deism, where people start thinking that, God is like a clockmaker who wound up the clock and then set it going, and that's sort of it. But that's not a very personal God. It's not very, very person-like. It's much more sort of law-like, principle-like, mechanistic. To the point where you also see the kind of very thoroughgoing rise of atheism and a new kind of emergence of really a profound secularism where God is kind of removed from the conversation broadly. And a new sense of self comes online, much more focused on the individual, much more focused on being part of a kind of system, an economic system, a cultural system, this sort of a thing. And so just to finish up, we could just kind of round up the story so that people have can work with kind of the broad contours. This whole way of thinking really continues throughout the modern period and only really starts to itself become transcended or superseded or moved beyond in the 20th century, when you get the rise of a postmodern way of thinking about things, which looks at this whole way of looking at the world, including thinking about God, and critiques it and wants to expand it, wants to say, what's it leaving out? What's it presupposing? How is it not living up to its own standards? This sort of a thing. And so some of that very mechanistic and very kind of absolutistic rationalist thought that emerges in the modern period gets sort of blown up with postmodernism, and there's a turn towards thinking much more in terms of the irrational or the non-rational, or thinking about the periphery rather than the center, thinking about also the way that power has been exercised by that center on the periphery. So you see the rise of liberation theologies and theologies that emphasize the social gospel, caring for the poor, again, and strong critiques of sort of institutionalized religion, surges of pagan and neo-pagan thought, and all sorts of sort of alternative forms to what had been the dominant kind of hegemonic form of religion. And so, in a nutshell, that's sort of a lot of the arc of evolving notions of the God concept. And what excites me is trying to look at each of these moments as offering something important and novel to at least our understanding of God, of the divine, of the sacred, and trying to sort of do justice to each of these moments, rather than just privileging one over the other, or saying that, one's bad and one's good, or this sort of a thing. I'm really interested in trying to see how they're all part of some kind of broader learning process, really, and also then try to look towards the future of, what do we have yet to learn?
So this is a.
So if you hear my sheep buying in
a,
the background, I just wanted to say that's what that is.
yeah, a beautiful long wave arc story, and to parallel to it, this flying upside down imaginary weave, one can imagine that after the ministry of Jesus, that Christ spirit somewhat retreats, which is partly what defines the medieval period, which is why we see the return to some of the propositions that were before that, but also you see that the institutionalization that evolves somewhat is bereft of the initial inspiration that catalyzed it, which is a useful framing to see with any genuine arising. There is some spirit that's arising in the first place. Then when it becomes institutionalized, is the institution truly embodying and carrying the spirit, or is it the very antithetical impulse to the spirit? And so the way I hear that second arising that occurs around the Renaissance and leading into the Enlightenment is that the Christ impulse is re-emerging. But it is now not re-emerging through one prophet or through one savior. It is re-emerging into the activation of the whole human system, which is why we're seeing, even in the 11th and the 12th century, the arising of universities in Europe. So we are now activating the brain, activating the mind, and when I tell that story, I find tremendous significance in, as you said, it's a lot more about the self, and later the ideas that we each can develop. So there is an emphasized individuation aspect to this, because again, in the imaginary flying upside down view, you'd say something is trying to evolve with us so that as we evolve with it, it can continue to evolve with us, and it no longer is sufficient, finding the sufficient unlock potential in tribal formation. There has to be something about the one human configuration, the brain, mind, soul, spirit, whatever way you want to tell the story of what human life is about. The unlock of that must be through the individual person, so that perhaps later, as we will describe, get to the significance of this time, why it is so important to engage in these kind of conversational dialogic explorations, because now there is something else that's trying to emerge. But I'm jumping the gun there. I would simply say that to me that represents if I offered that the axial revolution was about revolving around the sun, so from a planetary human we were becoming a what I call Homo solaris, a solaris impulse around the sun. We are beginning to now nudge through the 16th and the 17th and the 18th centuries, but very much translated into commerce and the materialistic impulse. And then the way you are describing postmodernity. So postmodernity, I think is one of those moments where you describe both a continuity and discontinuity. Would that be right? And then how would you integrate into it the metamodern frontier and what you are trying to build into the next phase of the story?
Yeah. So yeah, I kind of rushed the modern and the postmodern there. So I appreciate you, excuse me, for highlighting some of the really important aspects of the religious evolution that goes on. And I do think that that's right. The emphasis on the individual that really emerges in a major way in modernity, I think, is a big part of the story, where you can look at this thing unfolding across this human story, where initially, I am my tribe, essentially. I am just, my totem, or there's a sense in which, the individual human life, let's say, is not particularly prized or valued or valorized. And there's interesting anthropological data on that as well. into, especially you could say in the kind of polytheistic period, where you get this movement towards the anthropomorphic deity, the sort of God in human form. But this is also someone that you worship, that is above you, more powerful than you, and also not particularly good necessarily. And there's a sense there also that like life is still not particularly about individuation. Let's say it's about, you're a member of you're a Roman citizen, or you follow this god or that sort of thing, and you're certainly a part of your family. And so there's been a kind of expansion of the notion of the self, but it's still very contained within kind of conventional terms. And the axial age is where you really start to see the first glimmerings of this new conception of self, where someone like Socrates can emerge in all of his idiosyncrasies, following his own daimon, and where messages of the not just the prophets but Jesus are emphasizing, the kind of the importance of the individual and the individual's relationship to God. Love your neighbor as yourself, and love God is sort of the sum total of the commandments. And so this movement towards all of that really shines an important light on the individual. And this is what really finally kind of begins to explode in the modern epoch, when we become very focused on the individual. The individual is, we have rights for the first time that, can't be trampled on. And there's a notion that individuation itself is somehow deeply what life is all about, self-actualization, and the kind of Jungian sense that, becoming who you are is sort of the vision here, and Nietzsche talking about all these things as well. And so, yeah, of course, there are shadows and dark sides to all these things as well, right? You see the rise of narcissism and this kind of, materialism as a kind of, way apparently to express your identity, this sort of a thing. And then in the postmodern move, I think that there's a trying to carry forward some of the importance of this legacy, right? Where, well, the modern period had given us, universal human rights, so to speak, but were we really living up to that? Were we actually granting those to all people? What does it mean when the United States gets founded, saying all men are created equal, but in, the founding document of the Constitution, there's a 3/5 clause talking about some people not being, so all these kinds of inconsistencies and lack of living up to ideals, all these things being left out of the story. And also, I don't think it's accidental that the importance of identity has become so huge in the postmodern context. Which is just a kind of further continuation of this notion of the individual, right? Now it's not, oh, I'm, British, or, I like these things and not these things, or whatever. Now we have this long list of our identity markers, and how we, what boxes do we tick, and these sorts of things. People are very hungry to have a sense of their own identity in that way. And I think that in some ways represents a continuation of that modern vision. And so there's a lot that could be said about a lot of what comes out of the postmodern moment. But I think one of the most important is just the appreciation of individual perspectives themselves, right? That there's a sense of, well, that's your truth. You have a truth, you have a perspective, I have my truth, I have my perspective. And in some ways, again, this is a very hyper individualistic way of looking at everything. But it's also grappling with the fact that as we learn more about reality, we come to learn more about different kinds of people in the world and different ways of being. And we don't have to absolutize these things anymore in the way that people used to. You see the emergence of an idea like a lifestyle, which is something that really is a really new term, and even new concept. But the way that some people will have different lifestyles than other people, or just modes of difference. And so the postmodern really, I think, reflects that move. And I think that that's one of its chief important insights. So where this all then bumps up against the horizon, or what's coming next, or what we're learning next, and where all this is going into the metamodern, is related to the limitations of these, right? Every time something evolves out of what came before, it's transcending what came before, because there was some limitation there that it needed to move beyond. So, one of the limitations of the postmodern is getting stuck in some of these ways of thinking about our perspectives, right? That like that your perspective is your perspective, my perspective is mine, and we all just have our own perspective on things. If you actually kind of really live from that way of looking at the world, everything fragments and fissures into perspectives, and it's just different stories and different truths. And as we're seeing more and more every day, that creates a lot of problems as well. We get alternative facts, we get post-truth ideologies, we get the manipulation of these sorts of ways of thinking for political purposes. Of course, there's always been the way in which this emphasis of a way of thinking was itself driven by certain kinds of political agendas already by postmodern thinkers in the mid-20th century. So we get the politicization of ideologies and ways of thinking and identity and all this stuff that leads to social decoherence and breakdown, inability to speak across differences. I could go on and on. There's a lot of problems that wind up emerging from these insights. And one of the things that I think the metamodern turn is trying to gesture to is trying to move past that. It's trying to say, okay, is there a way that we can get some coherence once we take stock of the difference as well, right? Maybe we do all have different perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, every perspective is seeing absolute truth from its own vantage. Maybe it's seeing its own perspective on some truth that we can then coordinate perspectives is one way that the metamodern conversation is panning out. Another thing it's emphasizing is that, well, if there is something of value here in these different perspectives, how can we move between them as necessary, as called for, right? When does it make sense to maybe lean into being very rational and needing evidence? When does it make sense to kind of lean into not having to do that, leaning into the aesthetic? Or when do we want to just fully engage in a kind of ritualistic experience without having our modern mind turn on and thinking about, what is it you're really doing and all this stuff? How do we navigate basically these different modes of thinking? And one of the ways that metamodern thinking has articulated this through various influences from, other kinds of postmodernisms, is to give some kind of an account that we've been giving together, right? That actually all of these different perspectives come online as part of a sort of evolutionary learning process. And then we can actually learn to coordinate these things in a way that doesn't just lead to fragmenting and fissuring and incoherence. We can actually gain a sense of how to relate the world of perspectives together. And if we're able to do that, then we're actually able to kind of stand back on the postmodern recognition of perspectives and kind of go meta on postmodernism. And so that's, if any of that makes sense, hopefully it does, but that's a kind of quick way of talking about it. Yeah.
You're describing a metamodern move that's trying to address what we can perhaps describe as a perspectival Babel Tower confusion and chaos that in itself gave rise to polarization, everything breaking down in terms of politics and so on and so forth. So, and the individual phenomenology that accompany the meaning crisis, because one of the observations, the way I narrate and make sense with the meaning crisis that I know has been a central propulsion in your work, is that one of the byproducts, the symptoms of that perspectival Babel Tower that's breaking down is I'd actually state it first in the opposite. When one is joined by meaning, the phenomenology of it is enhanced interior conductivity that expresses itself with well-being, with brightness, with resilience, with intactness, with a sense of being connected with others, and a life that has a purposeful sense about it. So when you describe it, and as John Vervaeke described the meaning crisis, the accompanying phenomenology that I'm observing, that I think you have been responding to in your work, is the breakdown of well-being, the breakdown of mental health, a breakdown of resilience, all of which are symptoms or byproducts of the fracturing of interior conductivity. So an effective meta-modern move will have to have about it not just conceptual integration, but some way or shape or form that will allow the whole person to bring about enhanced interior conductivity such that those different parts can actually have a field where they can merge into a greater whole. That is the deeper sense of the cry that I am registering in what the metamodern move is actually responding to. How would you restate it or describe it differently?
No, it's perfect. I totally agree. I mean, my entryway into this was through a breakdown of meaning. To go all the way back to my own existential crisis as navigating this move out of traditional religion into kind of modern rational atheism and postmodern Nietzschean thought and all this stuff, was the occasion by which I felt the need for trying to, find a new way of being in the world. And so I think you're right to make clear that, talking about these things, it might sound like concepts following concepts, but this is ultimately a lived experience. This is the story of humanity, but it's the story of humans. And so human beings are moving through the world, and we're experiencing the social and collective consequences of all living together with each other through time and figuring out things together, learning together through time, and changing the world around us as a consequence. And when we do that, that kind of redounds back on us, and we experience that emotionally, psychically, spiritually. And so I think that this is ultimately what we are seeing when we're talking about sort of the consequences of really postmodernism, but in a sense, really the whole legacy of this entire intellectual, spiritual transformation that we've been describing. That it has had these ripples in our kind of psychic space that we're dealing with. And I think in some ways, they're particularly acute right now. There is, it's not an accident that a term like the meaning crisis has gained a lot of traction, that people resonate with that they understand it. And one of the things I often try to emphasize too is that these ideas are not just ideas in our heads. They get embodied. They get, what's the word? They get not just incarnated in the sense of human bodies, but they get materialized in the societies that we live in, right? And so when people go out their front door, what is the world that they encounter? Is it, one of a bunch of, let's say, fast food restaurants and multi-lane highways and concrete and pollution, right? That's the material landscape that they're entering into. But I would say that that's a kind of materialized nihilism, that there's a sense in which there's been a breakdown in value that then has allowed itself to be manifested in terms of the world that we inhabit. And then the lived experience of that world is one of nihilism, is one of meaninglessness and suffering and despair, loneliness, isolation, right? We were talking about individualism earlier, but what's the consequence when you play out a certain kind of modern individualism over the course of centuries? It's these kind of soulless suburban blocks where everyone lives in their own castle and no one knows their neighbor, no one talks to each other, there's no community. And what is the lived experience of that? It's despair, it's meaninglessness, right? So these worldviews that we've been kind of navigating, we've been talking about them conceptually, but ultimately these are lived experiences, and they get materialized out in the world, and they affect the way that we experience reality. And I think the net sum of where we're at right now, largely as a culture, and if we want to talk about the West as some kind of cultural block, but I think we see this as not just a Western issue. I mean, when you go and look at China, other developed and very kind of industrialized nations are facing the same problems, in Hong Kong and South Korea, right? It's not just about like culture in that sense of geographically, it's about culture in the sense of following this through line of pre-modernity into modernity into post-modernity. And I think that that leads to a kind of crisis point that we're collectively experiencing, albeit, let's say, it's spread out in different ways around the world at different densities. But we're collectively experiencing a meaning crisis as where we are based on what we've been and what we've been doing is breaking down, and now something new needs to come out, or else, well, it just will. But, we're struggling and suffering from that.
Well, so that leads me to try to name some of the challenges of metamodern Christianity. And I imagine you could download a whole portfolio of challenges, but I'm interested specifically that if a metamodern Christianity is not just a fringe movement, but it rather is a way that will afford larger cross-section of society to find some kind of a new redemptive engagement, then I'd be very interested that we address at least briefly some of the core esoteric pillars of the Christian faith. First, how do we integrate the different dimensions of the Jesus person? Because when I look at it, there are maybe 5 or 6 dimensions of the Jesus person. How do we integrate these into a metamodern context? And then also, is there a way in which we can bring the Trinitarian Nicene Creed view into this? Mm-hmm. And I have some suggestions and thoughts around that. And then also, can we bring into this exploration a way of commenting about the different schools of thought around Christian eschatology, and especially the premillennial, the postmillennial schools of thoughts that are describing different end of days narratives? And is there actually a delicious opportunity to recognize some of these inside a metamodern context? Because if you are going to find a way to bridge to the larger cross-section of society, then these are going to be some of your challenges. I think the recent statistics is that certainly in America, there are maybe more than a quarter, perhaps some say even more than a third of the people believe in some kind of an end of days scenarios, in more fully or more tangentially. So how do we weave a story to that? Ultimately, what I'm putting on the table, and maybe that's a whole larger conversation, how can we tell a Christian story that is not just backward looking, but forward looking? That's the bigger conundrum that I believe you're trying to address.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so there's so much there, and I'd love to dig into each of those. So how about I'll throw out some general thoughts on that, and then whichever one you want to start with. But what I would say, right, is that, so I think we've named this situation that we're in, the meaning crisis. We've named the lived experience of the problem there. And we've talked a little bit about this kind of arc of the development of people's conceptions of the divine and unfolding and all that, and how that kind of, leads us to the present moment. What I see is a kind of crossroads that we're facing right now, is that as we enter this very challenging moment in a meaning crisis where people are suffering and experiencing this meaninglessness and despair and nihilism, there's a strong desire to turn back and look for some way of looking at the world, some worldview, some religion that seems like, oh, that's when meaning was working well for people, so let's go do that. And so you're exactly right. I think that what I'm trying to do is to particularly articulate a forward-looking perspective on Christianity rather than a backward-looking perspective. Because, and I see this, I'm seeing it a lot at the moment, and it's very disconcerting to me because of the consequences of making this kind of move. A lot of people around me are just trying to give up, as it were, on the modern or the postmodern way of being and jump back into a more traditional or pre-modern way of looking at Christianity as their solution to the meaning crisis. And I think that approach is doomed to fail, not just individually, but collectively. I think we're bound to get ourselves collectively, socially, culturally, in a lot of trouble if we think we can just ignore all the situations that are kind of facing us in the complexity of our moment and try to, return to some different worldview based on pre-modern notions of Christianity. So that is in many ways the backdrop of this project. That's one path on that crossroads. The other path is the forward-looking.
Let me just insert, the point you're making is very important and is a central point that I address time and again when we do a parallel epochal trace and story, where the key insight is why it is doomed to fail. Because we are in a phase transition. And in a phase transition, there is no way to put the genie back in the bottle, or there is no way to try to re-engage an older operating system. The challenge is, how do you take the best of that ancient operating system and indeed harvest from it the elements that you need to honor and integrate, and hospice what needs to be left, and make a move that ultimately is ready to configure a new operating system, which I think is...
And that's exactly right. And I think the argument that I want to make is that it's a theological argument, I guess you could say, is that that's also what God wants, meaning if there is this parallel track and God is evolving and we are participating in that, and that is this kind of divine dance that we've been engaging with through the evolutionary process of culture and of religion, then, just as I'm going to be 36 next year, I don't want on my 36th birthday to like have to go relive high school, or, it's like, oh, I've got to go live puberty again. It's like, oh man, I don't want to go back to that. I want to go forward. I want to build on what I've already done and continue the dreams that I've set up for myself and live the arc of this thing. I'm trying to move forward. I don't want to go back. And so in that sense, you could imagine that if this process is one in which we are co-participating with the divine to unfold into new directions, then it's antagonistic to the divine will, you could say, to want to just revert back to some earlier way of thinking. So that's a theological way of putting the issue. Simply a sociological way of putting the issue is when you try to go back to an earlier operating system in a different, more complex situation, you get some kind of profound cultural pathology. And a great example is Nazism, right? Is when you get a society that's been profoundly disrupted and disturbed. It's grappling with a loss of meaning. It's grappling with despair. And so what does it do? It turns to a sense of meaning that it thinks it can grasp onto, and that has a very kind of old style God King, mythologically informed traditionalist sort of pre-modern aura to it. And the result is millions and millions of people dead. It's war, it's genocide, it's, bad things. So that's another way of thinking about what happens when we try to just, go back. So yeah, if we're not going to break it down to a more, to a simpler way of looking at this, we need to break through. And so there is a version, I believe, of Christianity on the other side of the complexity of the world that we're in, and it's one that I find very beautiful. But it's a similar thing of continuity and discontinuity in the way that you're saying, right? Where we want to carry forward what is there in the tradition, and we want to leave behind ways of thinking about the tradition that we've since kind of moved beyond. And there's many instances we could also draw on from our own individual development of these sorts of things. I don't know, just as an example, right? Like when you're a kid, oh no, I'm a boy, oh, she's a girl, she's got cooties, and it's sort of like, okay, that's a very immature way of thinking about that. And then you grow up and then you actually get to have a full, rich relationship with your wife. And you're like, the benefits of moving beyond, of maturing, of growing, of learning are obvious. But I think learning in general presents us with this, that it's inherently something that opens us and creates new affordances, new freedoms, new insights. So I think we want to carry forward the Christian tradition by embracing all that we've learned and moved through, and carry forward the best and leave behind the things that are were important in earlier moments of God's evolution, but are not the current driving edge. So those are my general reflections. And then you raised a number of really important aspects to that. So whichever of those you'd like to explore.
Let me make a bridging comment to that, and then let's explore the few dimensions or persons in Jesus. Mm-hmm. The bridging comment I'll offer is that there is a developmental and evolutionary reason for regressive cycles. I mean, even at a personal level, we get triggered is another name for a regressive cycle. Something happens that we have not worked out that we get triggered by, whether you call it shadow element or whether in the new work that we're developing in terms of the portals into the soul, I'm describing that as the ghosts. When I get re-triggered to a down the timeline, I actually have an opportunity to become enlightened about something that I never integrated before. That is true culturally as well. We do have regressive cycles. So you could say that through the cycle that occurred in the 60s of the previous century, there was a liberation, several liberation moves that were on the march, and they also involved certain regressive dimensions, and so on and so forth. If you look through the 90s, there was a liberation move, but it also unleashed certain regressive cycles, and we are now through a profound, I believe, a profound transitional phase shift move, and inside it is expressing itself with some regressive moves. So I'm interested that we still try to address the Jesus character, because just at the simplistic level, and some of it was inspired actually by listening to some of your work. So I decided I could name 5 or 6 dimensions of Jesus. Let me run them by you and then ask you to make a comment as to how will you integrate these into a metamodern context. So there is the literal Jesus. That's the Jesus we read in the scripture, and we truly believe that his word, the words are the words that he spoke, and that these are the miracles that he performed. Number 1, the literal Jesus. Number 2, the parable Jesus. So we read the scriptures and we assimilate these as teachable tales that we need to learn and to learn to interpret, to interpret into a modern context. That's the second dimension. There is the historic Jesus, I think the way you name that. This is where we look to find the whatever archaeological, historic traces that we can identify with the geographies, the person, and whatever there is that we can track down back in history in terms of archaeological relics. And then there is the church culture Jesus, which is more of a narrative about the values and the socioeconomic ideals that he represents, and how perhaps these ideals can be translated into this modern or postmodern or metamodern context. And then I believe there is still an esoteric mystery school Jesus that I would describe as the soul and the actual Christ-led spirit that inspired the person to become the embodied enactment of that creational divine matrimony, of the idea that there is something about that God-human relationship where it is in the marriage of the two, the matrimony of the two, that there is a third element that is the perhaps evolutionary impulse that's arising, and perhaps that's one way of narrating the Trinitarian principle in this new context. And then there is the 6th dimension, which is the Christ idea is not just something that happened back at that time, but is a field of potential, a plasma state potential that we can live into, and each person can find as part of the field of their potential, such that there is a permission for a person to enter a communion of sort where there is a continual revelation of what is your life and your personal spiritual endeavor is about, and you can do that in dialogue with a Jesus Christ figure, or you can do that in dialogue with a Buddha figure, or you could do that with a goddess, or you could do this with any other divine choreography or cosmology that you can choose to assimilate. So that's just me offering you some tools to play with of how will you choose to integrate the Jesus dimension into a metamodern exploration.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I like these different dimensions that you've named. I definitely think that they allow us to they bring some insight to this. So there's a lot of ways one could go about thinking about this, answering a question like that. Maybe one, and so this doesn't exhaust my thoughts on this, but one thought that occurs to me, I wrote down these different dimensions, and then I started kind of trying to organize them a little bit on some kind of a spectrum, some kind of an axis. And so working with these 6 dimensions, I want to pose to you the idea, what if we think about these as being on some kind of a continuum? And I would, and again, this is the first time I've heard these, so I'm just playing with this, but I'll throw this out to you. So if we move from, let's say, the order I would suggest is historic to literal to church culture to parable to archetypal is the word I would give that thing, and then the esoteric finally, as being sort of a spectrum that we could locate these different dimensions on, and that all offer something unique, and that they all have their values. They maybe also all have their challenges or problematics to them. But I do think that I would probably say that as you move along that spectrum, there's going to be a deeper value that I'm finding there in the metamodern Christian framework. Which means that if we start with the historic, right, that would be where I would place the least amount of integrative value relative to the tradition, right? And this brings back my own, story that I got into, which is that I moved through a traditional faith and then studied the historic Jesus. That was actually really the moment that I gave up my traditional faith, was when I studied the historical Jesus studies of the 20th century. Because I could say a lot about that and have another context, but briefly, I just feel like if we want to hang our hat, if Christianity wants to hang its hat on history, I think it will suffer. I don't think that is the right way of thinking about it. I think there are many ways that are justified in saying that even the ancients didn't think that was the right way of thinking about it. But I also think that we really need to appreciate the novel insights of each of these moments in God's evolution. And that modern moment was a really important one, where things got clarified in a way, and where thinking historically about, let's say, the Bible, let's just say the Gospels, the person of Jesus, the way that was done in that historic moment of modernity gave us new insights that I really think we need to integrate and carry forward. So I'm not saying that we don't integrate the historic, but I think that when we integrate the historic, we actually have to wind up dealing with a very different picture of Jesus than is the sort of Jesus that I think gives us the most spiritually robust kind of frame of engagement. So I'd situate that first. Then there's the literal, which I took as you saying, talking about the words on the page, sort of. So there's the Jesus on the page. And the Jesus on the page is again, that's going to be different from the historic Jesus, because we're getting this filtered through the gospel writers and that sort of thing. So here we're dealing with the Jesus of story. And here, I think there's even more value if we can really sink into that. I studied the Bible as literature. That I feel like is a very powerful lens and a perspective on the biblical materials that can be very meaningful and significant, where we can appreciate the value of stories on their own terms rather than have to peg them to some historical occurrence, right? We can say that the story of Jonah and the whale is a profound story, whether or not we actually think there was a Jonah and whether he got swallowed by a whale and this sort of a thing, right? So the literal Jesus, in that sense, I think there's a lot that can come through there. I next had parable, but I actually then decided to swap that with church culture, because I think that that would be sort of next in the sequence, where it's not just the story, it's the whole ethos, it's the whole aura, it's the story of the stories, and the creation of new stories and new traditions and new images and all of that stuff that comes through. And here I really get excited about what the Christian tradition has to offer, because the cultural Christianity, we can say, that spans 2,000 years is so rich and encompasses everything from, early hymns to Bach's oratorios to Michelangelo's art on the Sistine Chapel, to Greek Orthodox icons, and on and on and on. There's so much there that I think that we should carry that forward so much. And I think any metamodern Christian should appreciate the whole treasure trove of Christian cultural history as there for engagement. And then I have the parable Jesus, which again, these could be swapped. I don't know, but I think that when you read the parables in Jesus's, stories, there's something there that is truly timeless, that more than the theology and the interpretations of who Jesus was or how he might have fit into certain kinds of notions of a, messianic figure or whatnot. When you read the parable of the Good Samaritan, or you read the parable of the prodigal son, these endure. These speak to us at a deep soul level that I feel like that's scripture, right? That's it. That is enduring scripture. More could be said about that, but just to round this off, then I get to the archetypal. And I think that for me is where probably I tend to resonate most with Jesus, which is to say Christ as the Christ archetype, which is, and you were explaining that well earlier, that there's this way that we can find that Christ in us, in our own moment, that there's some way that we can show up in the world in a Christ-like fashion, and by drawing on all of what we've been talking about. But I think that this is a very expansive notion then of Jesus, that we can even see, you could say, the Jesus in Achilles. We could see we could see the Christ, in Buddha, these sorts of things. We're at this archetypal level where we're really at a very profound, universal kind of engagement and deep psychological kind of engagement with these things. And there, I would say, is really, I think that those are the depths that a metamodern Christianity should really plumb. And then just real quick, the last thing I'll say on the esoteric element is this, to me, is the most mysterious, right? I think that there's possibly a way in which you could think of the esoteric as somehow wrapping all of these together and finding some truth finding total truth in all of these in some way that maybe is a bit beyond me, who still wants to try to put things in sequences and map things out. And maybe there's some really insightful, profound, esoteric relationship to Christ that is able to even look at the historic Christ and read some profound truth there in some sense. And so I leave that very much as sort of my horizon would be. Anyway, so that's kind of my take.
Yeah, well, let me build on this. I know we're kind of stretching our time, but let me do one more concretized example with actually a build on the reordering that you offered. So if I decided to abide and double click with the story of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. So I'll go with your ordering. So the historic trace, I will actually look to travel to these places, which I have been born and raised in Israel and often been all over the area of Sea of Galilee. So I will go to these places and try to imagine what actually occurred when that occurred, and whether there is any archaeological trace. And so that was the historic, number 1. And you proposed that number 2 would be? The literal. Okay, so I'll be in that place, which I have, and I'll actually read the words right there. So I get a scriptural experience in the geography, and I try to imagine what parts of that story can actually be traced to some kind of a 5 senses experience, and bring it to life in my imagination. And then you suggested that you'd bring to number 3 indeed the church message. So there is, when you contemplate that story, a moral about distribution of means and so on and so forth, and there is a socioeconomic vision that perhaps is locked in this story. And then there is perhaps the parable dimension of the story, which is that one way to consider it is that, okay, religious teachings can offer nourishment to the multitude beyond just what is in the bread and the fish.
Man does not live on bread alone. Yeah.
That's right. Which leads me to the esoteric dimension, because the esoteric dimension would...
Let's put the archetypal next.
Okay, the archetypal next. So what would you say to the archetypal dimension in that?
In that story, I would say that Christ represents abundance, a giving of the self, the realization of fullness where there was emptiness, the sense of also a kind of faithfulness that by living into hope and the right orientation to reality, that abundance and richness can come about. So notions like that, probably.
Well, this is beautiful, because what it reveals is that often indeed an archetypal formulation is one step removed from the essence spirit realm, and what was, and here is how I will narrate the esoteric description of that moment in time, out of which we can see the archetypal formulation that you offered, which is that, could we imagine that Jesus, in his moment of Christ communion, is able to address a large group of people, and that in that communion, which is something that envelops his own experience, there is something that he is able to transfer to people which is invisible. But we understand that, Brendan, that in peak experiences, when you are in communion with an energetic property that is luminescent and compelling, that it carries even the power to reroute and supersede the biological programming of I need to eat because it's noon, or we understand that a lot of the digestive process is habitual, and that there are ways in which unique peak experience can override, at least in a transitional way, that drive, that experience. So could it be that what is being described in this story is a moment of communion, where the 5 loaves represent in that the way that communion is charging and transmitting to the 5 energetic centers of the human constitution, which we know by 5 fingers and 5 senses and 5 extensions to the body. So we understand that there is something 5-fold about the human system, and that the 2 fish are representative of the higher communion capacity, if you like, the higher mental capacity and the higher emotional capacity, and that those 2 dimensions or energetic centers are addressed and metaphorically described through the 2 fish. And that those faculties are entering a flow state. And when you are in flow state, to which the fish would be a good metaphor, then at least for a certain time inside the collective state, you are not so worried about just getting your next meal, because you are getting something else in that ecstatic state. That would be one way to describe an esoteric, energy-infused, inspired dimension of the story that will then truly be archetypally described as abundance that is generated out of that ecology, conductive ecology, that was afforded in the communion that he was generating with those hundreds or thousands of people around him.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like these these are the places where I feel like I'd love to have more conversations, because this butts up against um, this thing uh, that I feel like is really worth parsing in some really important ways. And I'm not close to moving in those directions, but there's something there. I guess I'll put it this way, right? Like, there are ways that we can move in those directions that actually look a lot like going back, and there are ways that we can move in those directions that are moving forward. And so I want to be very careful that we don't slip into moving back by heading into the esoteric in certain ways that where we could be going forward. So that, I think, is a big question mark for me, and it's my own learning edge, growth edge. I'm really open to exploring that. And I think in some ways, meta-modern Christianity is sort of also comfortable. Maybe I'm projecting. It's kind of comfortable being okay at like reaching a kind of archetypal ceiling, almost, as it were. I don't want to speak for other people so much, but I do think that there's something about, like, if you are familiar with spiral dynamics or integral theory, right? There's something in which you can relate the metamodern to the yellow or the teal, whereas both those systems have, something beyond that, whether that's turquoise or, whatever. And so I think that there's historically already been in some meta-modern conversations this appreciation of, like, there's a liminality to the meta-modern that's sort of right on the edge of both. It's like beyond just rationalist thought, and it's in the level of systems thinking and sort of hyper-rationalist thought, you could say. But it's on that threshold, and maybe there's something beyond that threshold. But I think we also want to, like, move into whatever is beyond that threshold in a way that doesn't lose touch with what's down here, because otherwise, yeah, again, a lot of pathologies can enter in. So I'm most excited for what can happen in those dialogue spaces.
Well, let's develop this conversation in a part 2, or perhaps on your channel. And I hear the two concerns. You want for there to be a way to develop without losing touch with the ground, inside of which implicit there is a message: can we explore these next moves without needing to regress to pre-modern belief systems? And my challenge to us about this is, okay, let's do that. And can we, as we do that, search to expand a way of addressing these that is prepared to integrate scientific discoveries, but is not bound by too physicalist, too materialist definition of science, where the trajectory is almost just one directional. And I would like to propose that there is a way to perhaps explore complexification and learning in the universe, not as one vector, but perhaps a 7-fold or a 9-fold vectored exploration, in which there may be a way to integrate some mystery school ideas without needing to lose touch with modern and postmodern reality, and without abandoning scientific ideas, and at the same time perhaps pushing the envelope beyond the physicalist orthodoxy and dogmatic version of current scientific exploration.
Yeah. And I think that if we can do that well, then that really would be the cutting edge of, spiritual and Christian thought, and, in any other tradition as well that's able to do that successfully. So that's very much what I'm interested in. And, it takes at least a conversation, if not more, like this, to be able to set up the notion of kind of that problem space, so that, there's a kind of shared understanding of even what the problem is. And so this was, not just for that reason, but in general, this is a wonderful conversation. And I'd love to continue for like a part 2 and explore what that could look like. And I guess for me, maybe part of it would be like, well, I don't want to overset it up, but there's something around criteria of, like, how do we know that we're doing that and not the other thing, right? So there's so much that could go into that, but I'm open to that. I think as I say, it's probably the most important thing, that we could try to do. So
And even just what you started framing there, even in being careful to not overframe it, how do we know? So you are bringing the epistemic challenge of well, which faculty of knowing are we talking about when we talk about knowing? Because there is, so this is where my nudge will be, how can we integrate conceptual and head ways of knowing with other faculties of knowing? And could it be that we have left, we left behind certain sense organs, and that there was an evolutionary reason as to why we so much focused in the conceptual and the intellect, but that part of the challenge of this time is to not lose the intellectual capacity, but rather also not be limited by it. So that's the frontier that I believe we are confronting. How about if we leave it in this suspense, a place of suspense, but still give you a chance to offer any closing comment for the exploration today?
Yeah, well, just, a place of suspense is a good place to leave things. If one reads the Gospel of Mark, they'll know that the original gospel didn't really have a full resurrection. It was it leaves you in suspense. And I think that in many ways, I'm trying to pull things together here, and maybe this it feels tortured, but I think there's something to it. I think there's something also about Christianity that is itself a continually living in the openness of things, right? And so maybe in our next conversation, we can lean into that other aspect that got brought up around teleology and directionality and eschatology, because I think that's really important. So, I like there being an open-endedness that we can then find our way into next time, because I think there's something, that's not a downside. That's a really wonderful thing about the nature of this evolutionary progression, that it keeps unfolding, it keeps moving, it keeps evolving and changing, and that there's both continuity and discontinuity in that process, that there's flux and some stability, there's being and becoming, all these things happening in a kind of synergistic dance. And speaking of which, this conversation felt like that as well. So thank you very much for the great questions and inviting me on the podcast. And I look forward to round 2.
Thank you very much, Brendan. To be continued.
Indeed.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.